My mom sicked our 170-pound dog on me during an argument, hoping I'd attack her first. I almost didn't make it out alive. Throwaway. This is quite lengthy, so please bear with me. I have confided these feelings to a few individuals but have never publicly disclosed them. Some of my close friends are aware, as well as a couple of family members, though I doubt my family has ever been particularly concerned. This is an experience I've been actively grappling with for the last couple of years. It is not something I mention lightly. I carry a significant amount of trauma related to my mother, and to be honest, I struggle with the fact that I harbor such hatred for her. Ultimately, I aspire to move on and forget her entirely to eliminate her presence from my mind. There are numerous stories from our past, and I cannot recount every single incident, but I want to highlight the most impactful moments that have shaped my feelings. It's worth noting that I learned many details after the fact. To be open, I have bipolar disorder. I have known about this since I was approximately 13, but when I was 3, I confirmed this with my father. I was initially diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. My mother was insistent in seeking help from a psychologist, and once I received a diagnosis, she put me on a medication called Abilify. Yes, the one that's faced countless lawsuits. I was also prescribed other medications, but it became a constant cycle with all of them. Abilify was the only medication that remained consistent. I was undoubtedly challenging to manage as a young child. Babysitters often struggled because I was disobedient and did not socialize well with peers. My father finds it difficult to recall much about that period, as my mother had also persuaded him to take a medication that caused him to zone out at times. I forget the name, but I will update if I ask him soon. Additionally, he worked as a truck driver, so he was not home frequently. One of the most significant side effects of Abilify was its contribution to weight gain, which became apparent. I was watching a show called The Biggest Loser, which featured overweight contestants competing to lose weight, and since they had a children's section, I wanted to participate without comprehending the implications. My mother often teased me about it, she still does, as of our last conversation, and encouraged me. However, it wasn't the worst at that time, but everything shifted when my mother cheated on my father. There were many factors involved, but none justify her actions. This betrayal led to a bitter divorce between my parents. Although I wasn't present for much of it, I am aware that my mother attempted to deceive my father into saving the home they jointly owned from foreclosure, which would have drained his finances. He refused because he would not have the house anyway, and I do not blame him for that decision considering her actions. Keep this in mind. During this tumultuous period, I moved in with 2 family friends, and that was when I first experienced physical abuse. They lived on a farm, and despite being only around 9 years old, I was subjected to grueling manual labor and often whipped with a belt, once even across the face. My older half-brother protected me during that time, but he eventually had to leave due to issues with his father, another story I cannot delve into. So, I was essentially left to fend for myself. Eventually, my mother returned, and I remember feeling as though several months had passed when it had only been about a month. I was overwhelmed with relief and excitement, screaming and crying as I hugged her tightly. That moment is etched in my memory. At the time, I was unaware of my mother's actions. I only knew that my aunt and uncle were abusing me and working me excessively, and that my mother had come to rescue me. I believe she understood that. Immediately, she began sharing many negative things about my father. She told me how he got her evicted, how he was losing his mind and getting arrested, and she even accused him of being a drug addict. She claimed he cheated on her and provided other dubious claims. I later discovered evidence proving that all of this was false, and my mother attempted to manipulate me into believing she never shared such stories. Things significantly deteriorated when I was left alone with my mother. Around this time, she enrolled me in what could best be described as a special needs school. However, it was not genuinely for special needs children. It catered to kids deemed unstable and having any mental illness to warrant their presence. The teachers there were physically abusive, although it seemed they were allowed to be due to the school's designation. I later came to understand my mother's reasoning for sending me there. During this period, she became physically abusive towards me and began significantly increasing her alcohol consumption. While she had been drinking when she was with my father, it had been manageable. She would slap me, shove me, and scream at me. What has always resonated with me is her habit of calling me a monster, describing how I would always cause destruction and ruin lives. The peculiar aspect of that school was that it operated as a form of foster care. Interestingly, upon arriving there, I claimed I wanted to go, given how bad things were at home. However, as the school environment worsened, I became terrified of it. I mentioned this fear to my mother, which was when I truly began to fear her. Her response was striking. She told me that if I ever revealed how she treated me, I would have to live at that school indefinitely. My mother is an alcoholic, unstable, but highly intelligent, and she meticulously plans her actions. Keep this in mind. I did not process this at the time. She had placed me in that environment solely to intimidate me into silence about her abuse. This tactic was effective for several years. Although I had outbursts, I never disclosed the full extent of my experiences and was always too frightened to approach the police, even after I graduated from that school to one deemed an actual school because they considered me a functional child who did not require behavioral health treatment. I reached my father's height, 5'7", by the time I turned 13, and my mother adopted the mindset that he's bigger than me, so he can endure the abuse, which amplified her physical aggression towards me. This was also the time she acquired her American bulldog, which, as an adult, weighed about 170 pounds. She was cruel to him, often hitting him to force obedience and teaching him to jump at people when she yelled. You can imagine how he acted when she shouted at me, "Remember this." Additionally, she blamed his aggressive behavior on me hitting him, which was a complete fabrication. During this time, I discovered my diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and my mother frequently dismissed my feelings by saying, "Oh, he's bipolar," to downplay everything I expressed or to spread lies about me, portraying herself as a struggling mother dealing with an uncontrollable child. That is an inaccurate representation of bipolar disorder, as you can surmise. Keep this in mind. To be fair, my family seemed to believe her narrative. It didn't help that, at the same time, she refused to medicate me. Remember this. Fortunately, when I turned 13, I moved in with my father, which significantly improved my situation, but I still struggled. I lashed out at my father and became problematic, too afraid to share the truth about my mother with him. Hence, he assumed I was just an unruly teenager, attempting to get me back into therapy and properly medicated. I stirred up considerable trouble, and while I was merely a child, I likely contributed to the downward trajectory of events that followed. For instance, I caused my father to be evicted from an apartment when I was 16 because I broke a television that had been discarded, which prompted someone to call the police. That gives you an idea of the extent of my acting out. I made serious mistakes, and I genuinely regret them, even if I was only 16. During that difficult time, while my father struggled to stabilize his situation, I had to return to my mother. This was when she, for reasons I only partially grasp, committed one of the most horrendous acts I can imagine. For context, she was entangled in a legal battle with her previous employer. She worked as their accountant and, out of paranoia, burned $250,000 from their accounts. She did not steal it for herself. She made it disappear deliberately. At that time, she was working as a freelance accountant for affluent clients, like lawyers and doctors, claiming to earn significant money. Additionally, she had a friend managing her legal case without charge because the lawyer owed her a favor. Despite her situation, she possessed substantial financial resources. I want to emphasize that this was not a struggle for my mother at that time. However, a few months after I moved in, my mother relocated us to a dreadful one-bedroom house in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in our area. I was forced to sleep in the living room on her futon, which was broken and wouldn't lay flat, which her dog occupied most of the time and would growl and snap at me if I attempted to lie down. On top of that, she ceased picking up my medications. I recall urging her to obtain my prescriptions, resulting in her dismissive response of advising me to get a car and go get them myself, which was impossible for me at that age since I was too young to legally pick up prescription medications. She would also invite her friend over frequently, who would consistently insult me alongside her. Despite all of this, the one thing that kept me sane was my friends. I could not visit anyone because I had no transportation, but I had my laptop, allowing me to communicate with my friends online. That helped me cope with day-to-day life. Then my mother cut off the internet. I remember it being so abrupt. I was bewildered and terrified. I ran outside, where she was on a call with my older half-sister, which she often was during these situations, as I ran out, confused, crying, and screaming. My mother was in the backyard, and I was by the gate leading to the front. She began asserting that I was attacking her and the dog, claiming I was going crazy and needed to leave. I recall crying and screaming while I asked what had happened. I later learned that she had disconnected the internet because I wasn't working for it. After accusing me of attacking her and the dog, she hung up on my sister. I will never forget the utter lack of emotion in her eyes as she shouted, "Fucking kill him, dog!" She directed that 170-pound bulldog, her intended attack dog. It was far worse than her usual yelling. The dog lunged at me, and I barely had time to react, but I managed to evade him. I quickly closed the yard gate between us and ran inside, hiding by the bathroom. There was a doggy door to the back room, but it had a large metal cover, so I thought I was safe. However, the dog broke through. I was incredibly fortunate. He aimed for my neck, but I raised my right arm just in time, and he bit that instead. Fortunately, he got stuck in the bathroom doorway, allowing me to slam the door shut and shove him off before he could overpower me. Had any of those circumstances been different, I might not be here to tell this story. Even with the dog locked behind the door, it was not over. As I mentioned, my mother is a planner. This ordeal was a part of her scheme. She orchestrated the situation to provoke me into a frenzy, allowing her to unleash the dog on me and portray herself as a victim, while I would be seen as the unstable, bipolar son she had been victimizing for years. It was all too believable for her narrative, but she had a backup plan if this approach failed. She contacted the police, claiming I was unstable and needed to be confined in a mental institution. Her friend entered the kitchen, berating me for the damage that I had caused, while telling me I was better off dead and away from everyone before brandishing a knife and placing it on the counter. This provided ample justification for the police, who arrived to find me with a bleeding bite wound on one arm and a laceration on the other. Consequently, I ended up in a mental health facility. However, the doctors there quickly assessed me and determined that I was mentally sound and not suicidal. I had simply been thrust into a highly distressing situation and panicked. They also restarted my medication. They initially informed me I would be there for 3 days, but 2 weeks passed. It became clear that my mother's plan was to abandon me in that hospital, which was more complicated than it initially appeared. She specifically requested that I be placed in a hospital situated in a district that despised my father. Somehow, she managed to transfer full custody of me back to my father without him ever realizing it. As those 2 weeks elapsed, the staff began to panic, asking when my father would pick me up, which bewildered me, since my mother had been responsible for this arrangement. They could not keep me longer, so I was transferred to another facility for 2 weeks, where the staff would inquire daily whether my father was abusive, which was perplexing, as it was my mother who had caused this chaos. Yet nobody believed me. Eventually, my father arrived to collect me. He received a call from social services, warning him he would be arrested for child abandonment otherwise, which left him equally confused. With no place to take me, he had to pick me up, forcing us to stay in hotels for about a month until he could find a stable home. While I was with my mother, my father had been saving to purchase a home for us in a nice neighborhood close to a good school that promised stability. My mother discovered this, and out of spite for not rescuing the home she had ruined for him after her infidelity, she retaliated. Her backup plan for my demise was to once again sabotage my father's life while ruining mine in the process. I only learned about this particular aspect a few months ago. Until then, I only knew that she intended to have me locked away in the hospital to avoid dealing with me again, without comprehending how incredibly petty and vindictive she was. Her sense of entitlement in orchestrating such schemes is mind-boggling. I have omitted many details, such as how she mocked me when I revealed I was a furry or how she refused to collect me from school if it conflicted with her plans. However, I believe the accounts I've shared paint a very clear picture of my experiences with her. The most painful realization is her complete lack of remorse. When I turned 19, unaware of many of the profound details from my childhood, my mother and I attempted to reconnect, believing it would be better since she was sober. However, her sobriety made me see that her negative traits were intrinsic to her character. I tried discussing our past, and she never once expressed genuine remorse. Instead, she either tried to manipulate my perceptions or positioned herself as the real victim in those situations. Furthermore, she has evaded any consequences for her actions. Nobody seems to believe she ever acted in such ways, and she now enjoys a seemingly happy life in the mountains with a new partner. Still, the pain she inflicted on me lingered. It taught me the type of person I never want to become. Regardless, I know enough about her to realize that no matter how successful she appears, she will never find true happiness. She is a self-loathing narcissist who believes the world is against her, leading her to harm others first. Though she perceives herself as exceptional, deep down, she acknowledges her shortcomings. I have witnessed that facade slip at least twice, so I am aware of the truth. Returning to the beginning, I must assert that I do hate her. This hatred causes deep pain. She is my mother, the only parent I will ever have, and she genuinely tried to harm me for reasons I still do not fully understand. I wish I had a mother I could love. Even after all I have endured, I attempted to convince myself for years that I loved her, but I did not. It took even longer to recognize that what I truly feel is hatred. Unadulterated, intense hatred. It is not a positive emotion. It is an all-consuming feeling that exacerbates everything, serving as the primary barrier preventing me from moving past the trauma associated with her. Right now, I am motivated to work towards relinquishing my hatred. I do not want her in my life again, nor do I wish to love her again. I simply want to reach a state of emotional neutrality toward her one day, so I can move on from that chapter of my life once and for all. I am uncertain about what this means. I do not know if it involves forgiving her, distancing myself from my entire family, or making difficult choices. However, I am determined that, eventually, I will conquer the demons she has left in my mind. Story 2. New youth minister booted me from church for no reason. Years later, I spotted him stacking shelves at a bus station. Sweet karma. Summary: the church youth minister spread unfounded rumors about me and had me expelled from the church I had attended my entire life, driven solely by spite. I found someone who despised him even more than I did, and I provided him with information that he used to orchestrate a meticulous and effective plan to utterly destroy the youth minister's life. Ultimately, he was dismissed and ostracized, struggling to secure employment. By coincidence, I spotted him several years later, working a miserable job delightful. Approximately 6 to 7 years ago, I was studying to become a minister at a conservative Christian college. Since childhood, I had participated in the same, Bible-believing, church. It was sizable, with roughly 1,000 members, but not classified as a megachurch. This church had been a significant aspect of my existence for as long as I could recall. I played the piano for the youth choir, preached at the children's church service, which coincided with the adult service in the church's chapel, and drove the church bus to pick up children who were not regularly attending church, among other responsibilities. All of this I performed voluntarily, without any reimbursement for expenses. During my final year of college, we welcomed a new minister of music, education, and youth. He was as appealing as a dessert garnished with sharp objects. For the sake of this account, I will refer to him as Mr. Charming. The deacons and their spouses adored him and thought he could do no wrong. He was an overbearing individual. In his initial meeting with the youth group, he declared that his role was to reform the youth group. One of his favorite quotes was, "When I instruct my disciples to jump, the only inquiries they can make are how high and how far." The adults were fond of him, while the youth detested him. Within a few weeks, half of the high school and college students, essentially all those without parents in the church, had stopped attending. Most youth directors would have faced consequences for this, but he audaciously claimed in front of the entire congregation during the Sunday morning worship service that he had removed all of the thorny ground from the youth group, a nod to the parable of the sower in the Bible, and the pastor and deacons praised him for it. He did not hesitate to pursue his true ambition, the pastor's position. The pastor, whom I shall refer to as Pastor T, was approximately 60 years old. In just a few weeks following Mr. Charming's arrival, rumors began to circulate regarding Pastor T's health. He was an enthusiastic runner and cyclist, and that he did not seem as mentally sharp as he once was. He often quoted lengthy Bible passages from memory, sometimes in Greek or Hebrew, without ever misquoting. Most troubling were the assertions that he was too liberal for the church. Being suspected of being a liberal in my denomination can be detrimental to one's standing. None of these allegations made sense, yet discussions persisted among the congregation. I am uncertain why the pastor remained unaware. Perhaps he was aware but too intimidated to act. In some denominations, such as Catholic or Methodist, church authorities appoint pastors. However, my church's denomination allows each congregation to call its minister. This framework means every pastor walks a precarious line one misstep, and they could be ousted. They do not even need to slip up. Perhaps they intently do the right thing, and it offends enough individuals to justify their dismissal. If, like Pastor T, someone simply maligns you, your job could be at stake. Additionally, since the church often owns the house, the parsonage, or manse, one's family could find itself homeless and destitute. Then I became a target. I still do not understand why. Months after Mr. Charming began his tenure, he contacted me and informally informed me that my services were no longer required for the youth choir, children's church, bus ministry, or any other function. He even indicated that he did not wish for me to attend any church activities, including the Sunday morning worship service. It later became evident that members of his family had been employed by the church at favorable salaries to undertake the responsibilities I had been managing for free. His wife earned more for playing a battered piano during a brief youth choir rehearsal than the primary organist received for leading adult choir rehearsals and the Sunday services. Her piano skills were minimal. This woman exuded bitterness, resentment, and latent anger. Nevertheless, she seldom spoke, preferring to sit in silence and glare, which was even more unsettling than when she did voice her thoughts. Emotionally hurt, I visited Pastor Titike's office and inquired tearfully about my perceived wrongdoing. I could not obtain a clear explanation. He merely stated, "People are talking about me," and suggested that if I wanted a favorable recommendation from him for minister's school, I should remain silent and comply with directives. Consequently, I began inquiring among my church acquaintances regarding the talk about me. Every single individual, every single one, stated, "Well, I hesitated to inform you, and I do not believe it, but here is what I heard." According to the rumor mill, I had impregnated my girlfriend and compelled her to have an abortion. I had not even dated since junior high, and I had been arrested for drug possession, with my father allegedly paying a significant sum to cover it up. I did not even recognize marijuana. There were additional rumors, but the gist is clear. I complied with Pastor Titike's suggestions. I never returned to the church again, with one exception, months later, as noted. It was heart-wrenching. I had devoted my life to that church since childhood. However, I needed Pastor Titike's endorsement to enroll in the minister's school, and the pain was unbearable even just driving past the church. Thus, I decided to maintain my distance. I began to contemplate Mr. Charming. Anyone possessing such malevolence surely had a past, likely a troubled one. I knew that prior to working for my church, he had served at a larger church within the same denomination, located about 50 miles away. That church was roughly double the size of mine. So, his move from a larger church to a smaller one was either a poor career decision or an attempt to escape something undesirable. There seemed to be something rotten behind the scenes, and it appeared to present an opportunity for me. By chance, one of my uncles and his family resided in the same small town, although none of my relatives attended Mr. Charming's previous church. I called one of my cousins, shared my experience, and enlisted her as an accomplice. I shall refer to her as Anne. The following Sunday morning, Anne and I attended Sunday school and the morning worship service at Mr. Charming's former church. Though Anne had never been a member there, it was a small community where everyone knew everyone, and she recognized most of the attendees. She began to inquire about Mr. Charming and received a wealth of information. All of her contacts described Mr. Charming as a notorious creep. He would flirt with and make suggestive remarks to all the girls in the youth group, even those in junior high. He was over 40 and had a wife and 3 children. Then there were the unwarranted touches. Although nothing overtly illegal occurred, he had a tendency to inappropriately touch the young women whenever their parents were absent. But as at my former church, the adults valued him for disciplining the youth. Our investigation spanned several weeks. I maintained a low profile to avoid suspicion. Mostly, I loitered, consumed donuts, drank coffee, and engaged in casual conversations about sports. Anne took the lead in questioning, as she knew many individuals, and it appeared entirely natural for her to attend this church in her hometown. After services, we would go to her home for a delightful Sunday lunch prepared by my aunt, during which we would document everything we had discovered. By then, Anne's entire family was involved in my investigation. They were as incensed as I was about my treatment, and our weekly debriefings became fascinating mealtime discussions. After a few weeks, I became increasingly convinced that by transporting several of these young ladies and their parents, friends of my aunt and uncle, to my old church, allowing them to recount their experiences to the parents of girls in the youth group, would lead to Mr. Charming's unemployment. However, we continued to uncover more and more information, so Anne and I kept probing. I was mindful of keeping a low profile because I did not want to anger Pastor T more than necessary. He was well connected within the denomination, and he could easily destroy my fledgling ministerial career before it could even commence. Eventually, after a month or so, Anne pulled me aside and said, "You must hear this." She introduced me to a sharply dressed, sizable man in his early 30s, whom I will refer to as Fred. We discreetly moved to a Sunday school room to discuss matters in privacy. Fred revealed that Mr. Charming had engaged in a prolonged affair with his wife. When confronted, she had initially denied everything, but Fred had amassed substantial evidence over several months. Text messages, voicemails, emails, even photos and videos featuring Fred's wife and Mr. Charming. Apparently, Mr. Charming derived pleasure from watching recordings of himself involved with Fred's wife. Subsequently, Mr. Charming would send these recordings to her, and they would share cyber intimacy through texting. They would later meet in person, create more videos of their encounters, and repeat the cycle. Fred ultimately confronted his wife. She insisted she was innocent, but the evidence was overwhelming. He asked for a divorce, full custody of their children, their house, his retirement savings, his business, her engagement and wedding rings, and every possession, including the dog. Although she sought legal representation, her lawyer warned her that if the judge viewed the videos, her prospects could leave her homeless, with her belongings reduced to a garbage bag. Fred then turned his focus on Mr. Charming. Despite still caring for his wife, Fred believed Mr. Charming had intentionally sabotaged his marriage. Legal action, suing Mr. Charming for loss of consortium, would be too time-consuming. In this rural Deep South, many individuals favor a more direct solution. In rural areas, police and potential jurors are often lifelong acquaintances. If you have justifiable reasons for your actions and behave sensibly, you can pursue your agenda. Fred secured a meeting with Mr. Charming, who was oblivious to Fred's intentions since Fred was a deacon and had children in the church's youth group. Remember, I mentioned Fred was a big man. Standing at least 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighing around 300 pounds, if he had any body fat, he concealed it well. He appeared capable of uprooting a 100-foot oak tree without breaking a sweat. Fred told me he didn't go alone. He brought several friends with him. One of them blocked the door, another unplugged the phone, and yet another stood behind Mr. Charming and encouraged him to remain seated. Fred compelled Mr. Charming to view approximately 10 minutes of one of the recordings before stating calmly, "I'm going to stand here and watch you pack your belongings. Then, you will exit this building and never return to this town. Otherwise, we will be back." Mr. Charming complied. A month later, he began working at another church, my old church, and started ruining more lives, including mine. Fred was unaware of Mr. Charming's new location. He believed that Mr. Charming had relocated out of state. He was surprised, thrilled, and enraged to discover that this scoundrel was only 50 miles away. All of this occurred merely a few months ago. Fred's love for his wife remained strong. They were undergoing counseling, and he hoped to restore their marriage. However, his ire towards Mr. Charming festered, like a volcano primed for eruption. His demeanor exuded a restrained rage that frightened me, even though I was not the target of his anger. The following day, I returned to that small town and provided Fred with a directory of my former church. It contained home addresses, phone numbers, and email addresses for nearly every member. I highlighted the pages listing the deacons and other church leaders and marked some of the primary financial supporters. I explained my previous situation with Pastor T and requested that my name not be mentioned. "Not an issue," he assured me. The next Sunday, I couldn't resist attending my old church to observe how matters were progressing. Mr. Charming was missing, and no explanation regarding his absence was provided. Strangely, however, the pastor seemed extremely anxious. His voice, usually rich and resonant, quivered throughout the sermon. I arrived just before the service began and made it a point to sit in the front row, center pew. The expression on his face upon seeing me was worth all the trouble. What I didn't realize at the time was that Fred had already taken action and executed a thorough plan. The entire church had received multiple, anonymous, emails containing images and videos of Mr. Charming alongside Fred's wife in various well-compromising scenarios and states of undress. The deacons and major donors received emails and express mail packages for good measure. Mr. Charming and Pastor T discovered nothing until the phone calls started flooding in. After the service, it didn't take long for my church friends to decipher the reason for my visit. It was incredibly rewarding. I had become something of a hero, even though I consistently denied knowing anything about the situation. In the months that followed, turmoil continued to unravel within my former church. Both Pastor T and the pastor of Mr. Charming's previous church nearly lost their positions, as they had misled my old church's deacon committee about Mr. Charming's departure. Ultimately, they managed to retain their pulpits, although many members left my former church, leading to some financial difficulties. There was speculation about potential legal actions for distributing unsolicited adult content to older church members. However, no one succeeded in establishing that Fred was responsible, and I suspect they didn't pursue it vigorously. After all, his wife featured prominently in the videos and photos. Both churches were eager to avoid a court case, as the details of Mr. Charming's indiscretions and his exploitation of a deacon's wife, while having unchecked access to numerous church youths, would ultimately become public records. Consequently, they silenced the matter. I never encountered Pastor T again. The trust and respect I had previously held for him evaporated, and I was certain he inferred some connection between me and the turmoil. Thus, my ambition for a career as a preacher in my denomination was effectively shattered. In any case, by then, aspiring to be a pastor like Pastor T was the last thing I desired. I withdrew my application for ministerial school and eventually earned a doctorate in archaeology from a different graduate school, graduating with honors. I have since been teaching at a prominent public university in the Midwestern United States and participating in summer archaeological digs in Europe. I have found great satisfaction in my current path. Lastly, one particularly gratifying occurrence, I am sharing this post for a reason the events I recounted transpired 6 to 7 years ago. Fast forward to last March. I went to collect a friend at a large bus station downtown in the United States. This location is widely despised. Not only is it overcrowded, but it is also poorly maintained and filthy. My friend's bus was delayed, so I stopped at the newsstand to purchase a soda and a candy bar. Guess who was restocking the shelves? Mr. Charming. I simply sat across from the newsstand, relishing my drink and snack. He recognized me but quickly turned away. I watched him silently as he restocked shelves with adult magazines and snack items. Revenge is a dish best served cold. Story 3. Starting to work again after years of being sick and an alcoholic. IF 29, have not been employed since the beginning of 2020. The company I worked for closed down during the initial COVID lockdowns, and then various events occurred in my life that prevented me from working for several years. I have been chronically ill since I was a teenager, and there were a few years when I felt better, from 18 to early 20s, and was able to work and remain generally active. However, my health deteriorated during the pandemic, and since then, I have mostly been home alone, ill, and in pain almost all the time due to my chronic illness. I have always experienced some social anxiety, but during this period, it became so intense that I could not even go outside on the days I felt physically better. This led me to rely on alcohol and sometimes other substances because I felt so miserable constantly. I have been supported by government assistance for disability since then, but I was living with my mother, who struggled with gambling addiction and often managed to take all my money for years. I felt trapped with no way out, so I continued to drink to escape those feelings and cope with the boredom and sadness of being unable to do anything. I have been in therapy on and off since I was 15, but a couple of years ago, I began attending a facility that focuses specifically on addiction treatment. Initially, I only participated because the organization providing my disability payments required me to engage in some form of treatment to continue receiving assistance. I never intended to truly address my addiction issues because I could not envision living without being intoxicated all the time. I was genuinely afraid of life without alcohol. I participated out of necessity and did not take it seriously. However, something changed within me, and I genuinely wanted to improve. Throughout this period, another significant aspect has been present in my life since my teenage years, but I do not want to discuss it in detail because people usually think I am crazy. I was diagnosed with schizophrenia at 18 because of it, and I dislike being misunderstood, so I tend to avoid the topic now that I understand most people I have met do not share my perspective. Nevertheless, this has always significantly impacted me. It was isolating to feel unable to openly discuss it without being labeled as crazy or sick, which contributed to my drinking. Last year, I finally obtained my own apartment. I do not know how it came to be. I had actually given up on that goal because I felt exhausted from trying to escape my mother and believed it was impossible. I always thrived when I had my own space and could be alone while still seeing people whenever I chose, without feeling pressured. Moving into my own place was what enabled me to become entirely sober. Since then, I have taken responsibility for myself and my life, which has been incredibly beneficial. I have also learned to establish better boundaries with others and have finally detached from individuals who were detrimental to my well-being, which had also affected me significantly. My relationships with all my family members have improved more than ever, even though they all currently dislike each other. That is beyond my control. At least I have a good relationship with all of them, which feels wonderful because I never really experienced that during my childhood, especially with both of my parents, so it feels as if some deep wounds have begun to heal. Since I have been feeling significantly better mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, my physical health has also improved. I still encounter challenges, and I have learned to accept that I will probably always have some form of them. That is just life. I have now entered a program to gradually reintegrate into the working world. I am not yet sure exactly what I will be doing. Initially, it will simply serve as an introduction, and we will proceed slowly. I will not be required to work 8 hours every day or anything like that. It feels incredible right now to have the support of numerous people in my life, including my therapists, doctors, and those who will assist me with this entire employment process, as well as my family members. I know that with everyone's support, I can accomplish this. I am just extremely nervous about re-entering the workforce. I understand it will be beneficial for me in numerous ways. I feel prepared, and I have been feeling great about all the responsibility I have taken for myself since moving, and I want to maintain that momentum. I want to continue growing and improving. I do not feel as fearful and anxious around people anymore. I feel much more self-assured, which I believe is a result of cutting off an individual who consistently spoke to me in a way that made me feel terrible about myself. Since severing that connection, I no longer believe those negative things about myself. I have learned a lot about my own boundaries, and now I know that if anyone speaks to me like that again, they are not meant for me. I still feel drained and fatigued when I am around people for extended periods, but I sense that I am learning to balance that, and with the program I am entering, I am confident that any workplace I join will understand my limitations. It is quite anxiety-inducing to consider transitioning from being someone who stays inside all alone every day, able to get up and go to sleep whenever I feel like it, to actually having somewhere to be at a specific time and being around people much more frequently. However, I am confident I can manage it, and I know it will be good for me. I finally feel as though I deserve to feel good about myself and my life, and I want to create positive experiences for myself and allow them to happen. Thank you for reading. I apologize if it was a waste of your time. It simply feels good to write everything out sometimes.